Arawak chat. Class will momentarily be in session. This is episode 19, Knocking at Death's Door, part 3. But before we get into that, you know how the ICCC do. And by the orders of Professor Hotstepper, it's a triple on the rocks. Listen.
Jean's mother said that I should leave her alone. But how can I do that when I want her in my home? I've watched her change from toys to boys, and now she is my size. So how could I forget her now when she can share my life? Mommy, I love your daughter, no gesturing. No one can make me leave her, it's no gesturing. So you can tell her anything you want, but I'll never let her out of my sight. Tell her how much I'm not her type, but one day she's gonna be my wife. Mommy, I love your daughter, no gesturing. No one can make me leave her, it's no gesturing. She told me I should wait until her 21, but she just don't understand that I'm a very impatient man. I won't let the horse run away before I go to close the gate. I don't believe in promises, those promises can fool my belief. Mommy, I love your daughter, no gesturing. No one can make me leave her, there's no gesturing. No. Now you can tell her anything you want, but I'll never let her out of my sight. Tell her how much I'm not her type, but one day she's gonna be my wife. Mommy, I love your daughter, no gesturing. No one can make me leave her, there's no gesturing. I said, Mommy, I love your daughter, no gesturing. No one can make me leave her.
Once again, sounds of brother Carl Malcolm, tune entitled No Gesturing, available at all good music retailers and stockists. Make sure you go cop it. Classic for the old school heads who know their reggae. You get me, the real deal. Here's the double.
Oh yeah, I'm alright. Yeah, born and raised down here in the ghetto. Poverty and frustration is all I know. Now I'm a man and I wanna clear that mess. It's hard to find a place in society. Work till you're dead in a decent job. When Friday comes, you can't even buy bread. The chance is on. The chance is on. If we make it in society. Get up, man. Was my nickname. Now I'm trying to become in society, man. Ghetto is my name. I like it. on, the chance is on. If we make it in society, Ghetto Man was my nickname. Now I'm trying, they call me Society Man. Born and raised down here in the ghetto, poverty and frustration is all I know. Now I'm a man and I wanna clear that past. It's hard to find a place in society. Work till you're dead in a citizen job. When Friday comes, you can't even buy bread. The chance is on. The chance is on. If we make it in society, chance is on. The chance is on.
Once again, sounds of Roy Cousins and the Royals. Tune entitled Ghetto Man. Available at all good music retailers and stockists. And just for the record, that was released in 1974. Original rhythms that. In fact, that takes me back to the days when Pops used to play them tunes there right off the vinyl. Oh man, memories. But anyway, here's the triple and then we're getting into class. Listen. One more time.
I want to dance with you all night long. My arms want to hold you all night long. As we embrace and your heart get close to mine, I get so excited I could cry.
Oh no, one second. Let me just pull that back to the beginning of the track. But before I do, Professor. Professor. Your avatar's killing it, Professor. You're killing it. One more time.
I want to dance with you all night long. My arms want to hold you all night long. As we embrace and your heart get close to mine, I get so excited I could cry. I want to feel your lips resting my mind as we swing and sway down the line. I can see the love light shining in your eyes. I get so excited I could cry. I want to dance with you all night long. Caress me, darling, it's all your charm. As we embrace and your heart get close to mine, I get so excited I could cry. Let me hold your hand all night long. Put your arms around me, hold me strong. I want to dance with you all night long. Dance with you all night long. As we embrace and your heart get close to mine, I get so happy I could cry. Oh, oh, oh. I wanna dance.
Once again, sounds of Mr. Gregory Isaacs. Tune entitled Let's Dance. Available at all good music retailers and stockists. Make sure you definitely go cop it. Classic, classic. As I said before, them tune there bring back memories when I was a young youth coming up in the 80s and my pops was banging them rhythms there, you get me? But anyway, this is Arawak Chat, episode 19. Part 3, knocking at death's door. And without further ado, Professor Hot Stepper, over to you.
Peace. Just want to say appreciation to DJ Gambler for beginning the show for us with the Triple on the Rocks. Shout out to ICCC.
Big ups.
Shout out to everybody. Shout out to the live chat.
Big ups.
Shout out to people on IG as well.
Big ups. IG squad, you're killing it.
Yeah, definitely, man. And yeah, so tomorrow is actually going to be a whole year since I've been on YouTube. My very first live stream on the channel, on the main channel that is, was on the 1st of September last year. So we've come full circle. So yeah, tomorrow will be a whole year that I've been live streaming now. So it's been crazy. So I am attempting to put like a little something together for you guys for tomorrow. If I manage to pull it off, it won't be a live stream, it will be an upload. But yeah, it'll be good though. If I can record it properly, me and Gambler are going to try and do something for you guys, and you'll get the upload tomorrow to mark the occasion. So we are trying to push that through for you for tomorrow. Thanks, Zico. Yeah, so yeah, it's been a whole year. So I don't know if anyone remembers the very first live stream. I think there was about 5 people in that chat, and it was for a while. It was about 3 to 4 hours, and it was just me and Chief. And Gambler didn't start doing music until the second episode. So that first one, it was just me and Chief just talking and basically having a little discussion between ourselves. There was no music, no breaks, no nothing. That was like one of the rawest episodes ever. Like it was just literally the first one, and I was just going through everything I had. You know, Chief was giving his opinion on some of the things that I've found. And I remember when it was dark. It was dark when we ended. When we started the live stream, it was like bright outside. When we finished, it was pitch black. It was night, but it was a good stream, and I still get people commenting on that stream now. So yeah, that's where things began for us, and from there we just kind of moved on to so many other things, so many other topics, discussions. Obviously, Chief, not too long after I started going live, he started going live as well and started using his channel, and he was able to do it in the Chief Inc. sort of way. And then his channel's been very successful, doing it in his particular style, and it's worked for him, and it's worked well. And we're just very appreciative. When we started, we weren't really expecting too much out of this. I think it would be safe to say.
Yes.
We were just seeing it as we're just dropping basically what we know or what we've found out recently or for a little while, onto social media now for other people to interact with, see and hear for themselves. But yeah, the way how things have gone over the year, you know, no one could have really imagined it from over and outside. So we do appreciate everybody that, you know, kind of bought into our way of thinking, our philosophy, you know, wanted to come together for, you know, for the information, and more importantly, for every original person of the Americas, you know, across the whole continent, because that's really why we do it. You know, if you're original to the Americas, somewhere on the continent, then, you know, we're for you, really. You know, no matter what tribe or clan it is that you may come from, you know, if you're original to the Americas, then, you know, you are a relative in some way, shape, or form.
And
So, yeah.
Professor, as I say, it'd be tomorrow, which will be the 1st of September from since you started live streaming. So that would be one whole complete calendar year. And then an additional 14 days later, which will be the 15th of September, when Chief Inca will have one whole full calendar year of live streaming. Outstanding, simply outstanding. And you know what? It's thanks to you origines in the chat and the silent viewers and listeners watching. You, quote Professor Black Truth, are the force multiplier. So for that, from ICCC, we say thank you.
Yeah, without a doubt, because, you know, it's weird, you know, you're all the way on the other side of the Atlantic, but you know, you're coming to terms with where you actually come from, and what's been covered up, what's been in plain sight the whole time, and to get that level of support, you know, from the home continent, you know, from the home team, you know, can't really put words on that. So yeah, we are truly very grateful. And we just try to give you what we can, and we try and mix it with some humor and whatnot. You know, we know that this type of stuff, it will drive you crazy, to be honest, if there was no humor in the middle of it all. It will drive you mad, because it's like something from a movie script, but it's not. It's real. It's real life. What happened, and it's still happening.
And that's the thing in it, Professor. You know how us origines do it, and especially us in the islands. And this is not to take away from anyone in the mainland. We have to throw a little bit of seasoning in our thing. We have to work it right, you know.
Yeah. For real. So let's see who we got for today. So I've just gone up to the top. So first of coming was Chad.
Big ups, salute.
Followed by the original Copper Empress Holbert. What's good, Empress?
Big ups, salute. The great auntie in the building. Big ups.
Then we also got, of course, Empress Copper Fox.
Big ups, salute. ICCC First Lady, Fire Mama.
Then we had Cherokee Tolly.
Salute. Big ups. Cherokee Tulu in that building.
Seeker of Truth. What's good, Empress?
Big ups, salute. Seeker of truth, always seeking the truth. She don't relent, she don't pet.
We have another Empress as well.
Big
Star.
ups, salute.
All right. We've got Nighthawk as well.
Big ups, salute.
All right. Michael Robertson.
Big ups, salute.
All right. Who else we got here today? Tomahawk. It's been a while. What's good?
Big ups, salute. War Chief.
And we've got the Empress Mama Red with us today as well.
Big ups, salute.
And we've got the head topper, Macadon One.
Big ups, salute. Warrior.
Yeah, I know. Macadon, I made this the other day, so I thought, let me just play with it, and I'll use it today, innit? Get into the anniversary spirit. So we're here today for our chat episode 19, part 3. So we're knocking at death's door, and we are up to the 3rd installment of this. So if you was present for parts 1 and 2, or if it wasn't, what we'd be looking at is the history of plagues, pestilence, germs, and diseases, and how this plays an effect on populations worldwide. We looked at the infamous story of the Indians who died from smallpox. We found out that still was hugely fabricated, and this statement was made by so-called historians, and we know historians bend the truth, but we know there's a fine line between truth and lies, and they even admit themselves from a academic scholarship standing. The story of the Indians who died from smallpox is, gravely, how can we put it? Inaccurate,
Yeah, it's one of these, a big one of these.
So we had them telling us that the story is, hugely inflated, highly fabricated, falsified, you name it, that's what the story is. And then, we was able to move on and take a look within the encyclopedia of plagues and pestilence, and it gives us an A to Z of how plagues and typhoids and all these other things have affected not just Europeans, but Asia and so-called Africa as well. So we know that Africa was suffering from plagues and smallpox, during the alleged time of what they say would have been transatlantic chattel slavery. So now we can put two and two together and say, well, okay, you wasn't taking African slaves because they were fitter than the American Indians, because they was dropping down with smallpox same time you was. That wasn't immune to it. So we know you wasn't taking millions of people for that reason. So who are the people that you was taking, and where was you actually taking them from? So it would make sense actually for you to take them from the Americas, because the Americas was free of all plagues and pestilence, all of these major germs and outbreaks and illnesses. So it would make more sense for you to use them, because they already don't have these things in their lands. So where we left off last time, it was a book by William McNeill called Plagues and Peoples, and we was looking at how the Mongol Empire had a huge impact on the spreading of the plague, and that's the book we're going to be continuing with today. So let's get into the screen share, and we will continue from where we left off.
And whilst the professor lines up the book, I'd like to say public service announcement. There was no Lacono Corner yesterday, and there will be no Lacono Corner today. However, watch for the notification. There may be an episode Monday or Tuesday. Just watch for the notifications. We're waiting on Mr. Inca, but as we know, Mr. Inca has been very busy lately. And shout out to Mr. Inca as well. I know you're listening in. Salute. Oh, and of course, there is no Empress's build tomorrow. It will be the following Sunday. And once again, the Empresses will be back with a vengeance. Professor, back to you.
Yeah. So, like I said, just keep one eye open. And if all goes to plan, you may see us throw a Lacono Corner in the next coming days, going into the beginning of next week. Okay. So last time we was up to here. I'll read the paragraph again, just to kind of go back on what we read from last time, because we was around this part anyhow. And shout out to Carly McLean, Empress in the building. What's good?
Big ups. Salute.
All right. So, geographic spread of plague infection in North America occurred naturally in the sense that the life patterns of ground-burrowing rodents create conditions for the communication of the infection from one underground city to another. When the rodent young have attained a certain maturity, they are evicted from the familial burrow and mill around seeking a new home. Some of the young abandon the community entirely and wander across country, traveling as much as several miles.
You're good, Professor. You're good. You're in 720p HD and in stereo sound.
Yeah, I did. Sorry, my bad, my bad. So some of the young abandon the community entirely and wander across country, traveling as much as several miles. Such wanderers will readily attempt to join a new rodent community if they find one. This life pattern provides a very effectual way of exchanging genes with the well-known evolutionary benefits such an exchange in parts. It also allows for the propagation of infection from one rodent community to another across as much as 10 to 20 miles per annum. Plague propagation among North American rodents was also accelerated by human agency. Ranchers actually transported sick rodents in trucks, sometimes across hundreds of miles, with the intention of infecting local communities of prairie dogs and reducing their numbers, thus allowing cattle to find more grass. But the spread of plague in North America, while affected by such acts, did not depend on human intervention. The upshot was that by 1940, no fewer than 34 species of burrowing rodents were carrying plague bacilli in the United States, and 35 different species of fleas were also infected. After 1900, human plague continued to occur sporadically in North America as well as in Argentina and South Africa. Mortality held steady at about 60% for those who contracted the infection until the discovery of antibiotics in the 1940s made cure easy and sure, so long as an appropriate diagnosis was made in time. But habits of life among ranchers and other 20th century human occupants of the semi-arid plains of America and South Africa were such as to create effectual barriers between themselves and the rodent flea communities in which the bubonic bacillus flourished. Hence, the occurrences of human plague in the newly infected regions of the world remained few in number and attracted little attention, especially since local authorities were often anxious to hush up the existence of so dreaded disease within their zones of jurisdiction. In 1911, however, a new and large-scale outbreak of human plague occurred in Manchuria, and again in 1921. Okay, Manchuria. What is Manchuria?
Just a wild guess, Professor, but I'm assuming that's Far East.
It is indeed, yeah.
It's funny how J. Rue the Damage did that tune, isn't it? When the East is in the house, oh my God, danger! Anyway.
Yeah. So, here we go. So the historical region of China, Manchuria, also called the Northeast. Okay, also known as Dongbei, Tongpei, formerly Guangdong. So this was a province of China. So this would make them Manchurians originally, before there was a so-called China, by the looks of things. So fresh international efforts were speedily organized to contain these epidemics. Investigators soon discovered that the human plague had been contracted from marmots. These are large burrowing rodents whose skin commanded a good price in the international fur market. But like the recently infected ground squirrels and other rodents of North America, marmot burrows sometimes house Pasturella pestis. Nomad tribesmen of the steppe region, where these animals live, had mythic explanations to justify epidemiologically sound rules for dealing with the risk of bubonic infection from marmots. Trapping was taboo. A marmot could only be shot. An animal that moved sluggishly was untouchable. And if a marmot colony showed signs of sickness, Custom required the human community to strike its tents and move away to avoid bad luck. Such customary prescriptions presumably reduced the possibility of human infection with plague to minor proportions. But in 1911, as the Manchu dynasty tottered toward its final collapse, long-standing government regulation prohibiting the Chinese from moving into Manchuria broke down. As a result, swarms of inexpert Chinese immigrants went after marmot furs. Knowing nothing of local traditions, the Chinese trapped sick and healthy animals indiscriminately, with the result that plague broke out among them and then spread along the newly constructed railroad lines of Manchuria, from what speedily became its urban focal center at Harbin. This entire sequence of events from 1894 to 1921 occurred under the eyes of professionally sensitized medical teams whose job was to find out how best to control plague. In some instances, researchers went to considerable pains to reconstruct the pattern of diffusion, whereby the plague had penetrated new regions and populations. Without such study and the prophylactic measures that followed, the 20th century might well have been inaugurated by a series of plagues reaching completely around the earth, with death tolls dwarfing those recorded from the age of Justinian and the 14th century, when the Black Death ravaged Europe and much of the rest of the whole world. 3 points seem worth making on the basis of what is known of mankind's 19th and 20th century brush with bubonic plague. First, the steamship network that arose in the 1870s was the vehicle that dispersed the infection around the globe, and did so once the epidemic broke out in Canton and Hong Kong, at the speed that was limited only by the speed with which a ship could carry its colony of infected rats and fleas to a new port. Speed was obviously decisive in allowing a chain of infection to remain unbroken from port to port. Since it creates immunities among survivors, Pasteurella pestis was, after all, certain to run out of susceptible hosts among a ship's company of rats, fleas, and men within a few weeks. In the days of sail, the oceans had simply been too wide for the disease to survive. On shipboard, long enough to make a lodgment in the seaports, waiting rodent communities of America and South Africa. But when steamships began to travel faster and, being bigger, perhaps also carried larger populations of rats among whom the infection could circulate longer, the ocean suddenly became permeable as never before. Second, infected ships, rats, and their fleas not only conveyed plague bacilli to human hosts in diverse seaports, but also managed to infect their wild cousins in several semi-arid regions of the earth. Apparently in California, Argentina, and South Africa, potential wild reservoirs for bubonic infection had existed for incalculable ages. All that was needed to create new natural plague foci was a means to convey the bacillus across intervening barriers, in this case oceans, to new regions where suitably massive populations of foreign rodents were already in the ground. Such rodent populations proved both susceptible to the disease and capable of sustaining an unbroken chain of infection indefinitely, despite wide local differences of habitat and speciation. No comparable unintended geographical transfer of an infection of importance to humanity has occurred since medical men became capable of observing such phenomena. But this does not mean that similar sudden shifts did not occur in earlier times. On the contrary, the history of the plague bacillus in the 19th and 20th centuries offers a model and pattern for such transfers, not least in the suddenness with which the infection occupied new ground when older barriers to its diffusion have been breached. The fact is that, however sudden and surprising they may seem, these recent triumphs for Pasteurella pestis constitute a normal biological phenomenon. For a new ecological niche, wherever presented, tends to be occupied quickly by whatever organism, human or non-human, thereby multiplies its kind. Thirdly, long-standing local customs among natives of Yunnan and Manchuria alike seem to have inhibited the transfer of bubonic infection to human beings quite effectually, despite the endemic presence of Pasteurella pestis in rodent burrows of those regions. Only when newcomers failed to observe local superstitions did plague become a human problem. Moreover, in both regions, the eruption of
You,
Moreover, in both regions, the eruption of epi
you okay, Professor?
yeah, so I was stuck on the page. Epidemiologically, uninformed strangers was associated with military political upheavals of the sort that have often provoked disease disasters in times past. So, in view of the apparent effectiveness of traditional customary safeguards against plague in Yunnan and Manchuria, one may recognize that the medical prophylaxis developed so successfully between 1894 and 1924 was a quite normal, though unusually speedy and effective, human response to epidemiological emergency. Instead of allowing myth and custom through a process of trial and error to define an acceptable style of human behavior that would keep disease within tolerable limits, as men had always done before, scientific medicine arrived at new rules of conduct and employed a worldwide political frame, international quarantine regulations, to compel general acquiescence in newly prescribed behaviors. In such a perspective, the brilliant triumphs of 20th century medical science and public health administration do not seem quite so novel as they otherwise might, though the fact remains that the medical discoveries of this century with respect to bubonic plague far surpass the efficiency of earlier behavior patterns for containing the ravages of the disease. Doctors and public health officers, in fact, probably forestalled epidemics that might have checked or even reversed the massive worldwide growth of human population that distinguishes our age from all that have gone before. With this modern and carefully observed example in mind, let us return to the 13th century and consider what probably happened to the distribution of Pasteurella pestis in Eurasia as a consequence of the new patterns of human movement that the Mongols inaugurated. We must assume that prior to the Mongol conquest, the plague was endemic in one or more natural foci among communities of burrowing rodents. In such regions, human populations had presumably arrived at a customary pattern of behavior that minimized chances of infection. As we saw in the preceding chapter, one such natural focus was probably located in the borderland between India, China, and Burma in the Himalayan foothills. Another probably existed in Central Africa in the region of the Great Lakes.
Wow.
The Eurasian steppelands between Manchuria and the Ukraine, however, were almost certainly not yet a focus of plague. This becomes evident if one compares the history of plague after its first devastating appearance in Europe during the age of Justinian with what happened after 1346 when the Black Death arrived. In the first instance, plague eventually disappeared entirely from Christian Europe. The last mention of the disease in Christian sources dates from 767. Arab writers likewise make no mention of plague for at least 150 years before the 1340s. One therefore assume a series of city to city within the Mediterranean region, the chain of infection among rats, fleas, and humans broke off because Pasteurella pestis had failed to find a stable, ongoing ecological niche within which it could abide lastingly. By contrast, ever since 1346, plague has remained chronic in Europe and the Middle East, right down to the present. Even when northwestern Europe ceased to suffer from the plague in the 17th century, Eastern Europe continued to be exposed. Moreover, in the 18th century, when consular reports allow a quite exact reconstruction of history of the busy port, the disease came via caravan from the interior, i.e., from the Anatolian plateau or steppe lands beyond, and spread from Samima or Samima by sea to other ports. The continued seriousness of the infection can be so missed from the fact that between 1713 and 1792, only 20 years were entirely plague-free in Smyrna, and in the 9 periods of epidemic, death tolls ranged up to 35% of the entire population of the city. So the contrast between Europe's recurrent experience of the plague of 1346, the apparent absence of the disease from European soil for more than 5.5 centuries before 1346 indicates that something drastic had happened to enhance Europe's exposure to the infection. In view of what is known of how the plague bacillus seized the opportunities that 19th century steamships offered for expanding its radius of action, it seems probable that in the 14th century, Pastorella pestis somehow did likewise and penetrated the rodent population of the Eurasian steppes for the first time, thereby inaugurating the endemic infections medical men in the 1920s discovered to exist in Manchurian and Ukrainian rodent burrows. Nor is it hard to find circumstances that might have permitted the transfer of Pastorella pestis from its earlier endemic focus in the Himalayan foothills to the broad northern grasslands of Eurasia. For in the second half of the 30th century, Mongol horsemen penetrated Yunnan and Burma, beginning 1252 to 53, and thereby entered the regions where wild rodents today lay host to the plague bacillus on a chronic basis, and where similar infection had probably existed for many centuries before the Mongols arrived. As in 1855, when unusual military movement allowed Pastorella pestis to cross the Salween and begin its 19th century peregrination around the world. Peregrination around the world. So also in the 13th century, it is entirely probable that the Mongol invaders disregarded whatever local rules and customs had arisen to insulate human populations from bubonic infection. Like Chinese marmot trappers of the 20th century, they therefore presumably infected themselves and thus inadvertently allowed the disease to break through former geographic limits. The superior speed mounted horsemen commanded meant that the infection was able to extend its range of action in the 13th century, just as it later did in the 19th and 20th centuries. Infected rats and fleas could, at least occasionally, hitch a ride in a saddlebag stuffed with grain or some other form of booty, and the rapidity with which Mongol military detachments habitually moved meant that rivers and similar barriers to the slow diffusion of the infection could now be crossed as easily as oceans later were to be. It does not require a very great leap of the imagination, therefore, to believe that sometime after 1252, when the Mongols first invaded Yunnan Burma, they inadvertently transferred the plague bacillus to the rodent population of their own steppe homeland, and thereby inaugurated the chronic pattern of infection which medical researchers discovered in Manchuria in our own time. So this could actually mean that these same people from the Mongol Empire brought some of these diseases to the Americas before the Europeans did.
Wow.
Because remember, Eurasia. So they are also Europeans as much as they are Asians.
Well, Professor, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. You've got Asian, then you've got Caucasian, and Caucasian means dead Asian. So, you know, they're pretty much the same folks, aren't they? But anyway.
So now, going to the next part. Let me just get a drink real quick. Okay. So exactly when and how this geographic transfer occurred cannot, of course, be exactly discerned.
And shout out to them. Sorry. Shout out to the empresses with their her bringing fleas everywhere.
Oh, I just see it now.
Sorry, Professor, I couldn't resist. Please, back to you.
No problem. To the emphasis.
Salute.
All right. So exactly when and how this geographic transfer occurred cannot, of course, be exactly discerned. Any more than the path by which bubonic infection reached the wild rodents of California or Argentina can be precisely described. On the analogy of events in the 19th and 20th centuries, we might suppose that infection of rodent underground cities in the steppeland began soon after the time when Mongol conquerors first erected a bridge of moving horsemen between Yunnan, Burma, and Mongolia in the mid-13th century. To be sure, infection in Mongolia was not equivalent to infection of the entire steppe. That would take time. We might thus imagine that for nearly 100 years, Pastorella pestis moved across the Eurasian steppeland from one rodent community to another in the same fashion as occurred in North America after 1900. One hypothesis, therefore, is that soon after 1253, when Mongol armies returned from their raid into Yunnan and Burma, Pastorella pestis invaded the wild rodent communities of Mongolia and became endemic there. In succeeding years, the infection would then spread westward along the steppe, perhaps sporadically assisted by human movement, as infected rats, fleas, and men inadvertently transferred the bacillus to new rodent communities. Then, shortly before 1346, the pool of endemic rodent infection perhaps began to reach its natural limits. On the whole, however, this reconstruction of events seems improbable. The trouble is that the Chinese records do not show anything unusual before 1331, when an epidemic in the province of Popay is said to have killed 9/10 of the population.
Wow.
So not until 1353 to 54 do available records indicate a more widespread disaster. In those years, epidemic disease raged in 8 different and widely scattered parts of China, and chroniclers reported that up to 2/3 of the population died. Even allowing interruptions of record keeping resulted from local disorder and a breakdown of administrative routines during the prolonged Mongol conquest of China in 1213 to 79. It seems hard to believe that any really massive disease die-off would have escaped the antiquarian compilers, whose list of disasters provide the basis for the only available information about Chinese epidemics. Perhaps a careful and epidemiologically informed study of all surviving Chinese texts, and they are extraordinarily voluminous, will cast more light on the question someday, but until such a search has been carried out, one must, I think, assume that the plague that burst so lethally upon Europe in 1346 manifested itself in China no earlier than 1331. And if this is so, one cannot easily believe that a Pastorella pestis had found a new lodgment in steppe burrows as early as the 1250s. If that had happened, China's encounter with plague would have begun long before 1331, and the vast cities and dazzling splendor of Kublai Khan's court reigned 1257 to 94, as reported to us by Marco Polo would scarcely have flourished as they did. By contrast, after 1331, and more particularly after 1353, China entered upon a disastrous period of its history. Plague coincided with civil war as a native Chinese reaction against the Mongol domination gathered headway, climaxing in the overthrow of the alien rulers and the establishment of a new Ming dynasty in 1368. The combination of war and pestilence wreaked havoc on China's population. The best estimates show a decrease from 123 million, about 1200, before the Mongol invasions began, to a mere 65 million in 1393, a generation after the final expulsion of the Mongols from China. Even Mongol ferocity cannot account for such a drastic decrease. Disease assuredly played a big part in cutting Chinese numbers in half. A bubonic plague, recurring after its initial ravages at relatively frequent intervals, just as in Europe, is by all odds the most likely candidate for such a role. Its interpretation of Chinese records fits well with what the best informed contemporary observers in Europe and the Near East were able to find out about the origins of the plague. A Muslim writer, Ibn al-Wadi, who lived through the initial onslaught of the plague in Aleppo, remarked that the disease originated in the land of darkness and spread through northern Asia before invading the civilized world, starting with China and proceeding thence to India and the realm of Islam. Aleppo, being a caravan city itself and a key point in the complicated network of trade that ran across the grasslands of Asia in the 14th century, was a particularly good place from which to get an accurate account of the spread of the plague. Christian inquiry into the prehistory of the Black Death arrived at the conclusion that the plague had first appeared in China. The second station in al-Wadi's account of the peregrinations of the disease, and had spread thence across Asia to the Crimea. What seems most likely, therefore, is that pasteurella pestis invaded China in 1331, either spreading from the old natural focus in Yunnan, Burma, or perhaps welling up from a newly established focus of infection among the burrowing rodents of the Manchurian Mongolian steppe. The infection must then have traveled the caravan routes of Asia during the next 15 years before reaching the Crimea in 1346, whereupon the bacillus took ship and proceeded to penetrate almost all of Europe and the Near East along routes radiating inland from seaports. Assuredly, the far-flung network of caravanserais extending throughout Central Asia and Eastern Europe offered a ready-made pathway for the propagation of pasteurella pestis across thinly inhabited regions. Each regular resting place for caravans must have supported a complement of rats and fleas, attracted there by the relatively massive amount of foodstuff necessary to keep scores or even hundreds of traveling men and beasts going. Such populations of rats and fleas stood ready, like similar concentrations of rats at grist mills in the interior parts of Western Europe, to receive and propagate pasteurella pestis whenever it might appear, whether introduced initially by rat, flea, or human carrier. Then, when the humanly or humanely lethal consequences of the local propagation of the infection became apparent, one can be certain that everyone able to flee would do so, thus transferring the bacillus to some new similar locus for still further propagation. And I think we'll cut to a music break at this point, because I know I've been speaking for a little while, and then naturally, when I come back, we'll carry on.
And as we slide to the bar for some light refreshments, it's a double on the rocks. Listen.
Looking for a place to have a perfect vacation, or even a honeymoon. I know the place to make the perfect reservation. Come, let me take you soon. Yeah. To a place called Jamaica, where the island is in the sun. Place called Jamaica, if you really wanna have some fun. Place called Jamaica, the island is in the sun. Place called Jamaica, if you really wanna have some fun. Food is great, people is great, wonderful place, climate is great, down there in Jamaica. If you wanna get away just for a day, tell them try Jamaica. Jamaica sunshine, Jamaica sunshine, Jamaica sunshine. Oh yeah, whoa. Chilling out in the west and the grill. I have my perfect spot to chill, watching the sun go away. Oh, what a perfect day. Oh yeah. No place like Jamaica to me, but where I go around the world, Jamaica my number one girl. Jamaica, Jamaica, Jamaica land we love. Jamaica sunshine, nice every time, nice every time. Whoa. At the evening sunset, in the warm summer breeze, crashing in, yeah. Relax at your best, set your mind at ease, yeah, baby, yeah. Jamaica sunshine, Jamaica sunshine, Jamaica sunshine. Looking for a place to have a perfect vacation, or even a honeymoon. Let me take you here soon. Yeah, love Jamaica.
Once again, sounds of the brother known as Jacure, track entitled Jamaica, or should I say Jamaica or I Maker. Available at all good music retailers and stockists. Make sure you go cop it. And I tell you what, I can't wait to go home. Trust me on that. Here's the double. Oh.
No matter how I try, can't get over you.
One more time. Oh gosh.
No matter how I try, can't get over you. No matter how I try, can't get over you. We used to be so together, sharing those times for the better. Those times were hard, but we came through, because we knew What happened to our love? Tell me, where did we go wrong? Tell me why. All that I wanted from you was your loving. All that I got in return was sadness. What did I do to deserve this reaction? I always thought that I was your attraction. No matter how I try, can't get over you. No matter how I try, can't get over you. No matter how I try, can't get over you. No matter how I try, can't get over you. What happened to our love? Tell me, where did we go wrong? Tell me why. No matter how I try, can't get over you.
Once again, sounds of the Empress known as Alpha. Tune entitled Can't Get Over You. Available at all good music retailers and stockists. Make sure you go cop it. Memories once again. Memories once again. Wow, Mr. Hot Step taking us back in time. And without further ado, Professor Hot Stepper, back to you.
All right, so we're here for our chat episode 19, part 3. Knocking at Death's Door. You're now looking at the Mongol impact on the plague, and we're seeing now that the plague actually began, with within the Eurasian steppes, with the Mongols, and from there it spread out because you know that Eurasia, what's within Eurasia, the Himalayas, what's connected to the Himalayas, so-called East India, Bharat, and from there the rest of Asia. So we've now pinpointed, a birthing place, if you will, for the plague and how it got started. So we're reading from Plagues and People, and this book is by William H. McNeill. So the chapter I'm reading to you guys now is all to do with the Mongol impact on the plague. So On this assumption, the spread of Pastorella pestis to underground rodent cities of the Eurasian steppe, where the infection was to find lasting, stable hospitality, occurred in a much shorter period of time than would have been needed if the bacillus had spread as it did in the United States from one rodent community to another without significant human involvement. An isolated bit of evidence supports the hypothesis of a rapid diffusion across Eurasia, for in 1338 to 39, an epidemic broke out in an Nestorian community of traders in their bones, and relying on the statistical analysis of burials and some ancient texts, concluded that bubonic plague had been responsible for the deaths. What probably happened between 1331 and 1346, therefore, was that as plague spread from caravanserai to caravanserai across Asia and Eastern Europe and moved thence into adjacent human cities wherever they existed, parallel movement into underground rodent cities of the grasslands also occurred. In human rat flea communities above ground, Pastorella pestis remained an unwelcome and lethal visitor, unable to establish permanent lodgement because of the immunity reactions and heavy die-off it provoked on its hosts. In the rodent burrows of the steppe, however, the bacillus found a permanent home, just as it was later to do among the burrowing rodent communities of North America, South Africa, and South America in our own time. Yet, epidemiological upheavals on the Eurasian steppe, whatever they may have been, were not the only factors in Europe's disaster. Before the Black Death could strike as it did, two more conditions had to be fulfilled. First of all, populations of black rats of this kind, whose fleas were liable to carry bubonic plague to humans, had to spread throughout the European continent. Secondly, a network of shipping had to connect the Mediterranean with Northern Europe, so as to be able to carry infected rats and fleas to all the ports of the continent. Very likely, the spread of black rats into Northern Europe was itself a result of the intensification of shipping contacts between the Mediterranean and Northern ports. These date on a regular basis from 1291, when the Genoese admiral opened the Straits of Gibraltar to Christian shipping for the first time by defeating Moroccan forces that had hitherto prevented free passage. Sounds like the Moors. Improvements in ship design occurring in the 13th century made year-round sailing normal for the first time and rendered the stormy Atlantic safe enough for European navigators to traverse even in winter months. Among other things, ships constantly afloat offered securer and more far-ranging vehicles for rats. Consequently, rat populations could and did spread far beyond the Mediterranean limits that seem to have prevailed in Justinian's time. Shout out to Dre Soul, what's good?
Big ups, salute.
Yeah, I saw you was at Carnival, Dre. What's good, man? How was it?
Oh, and just for the record, Brother Chad, the council is aware of that festival that's happening in mainland Europe. I mean, mainland Europe, the entitled Bomber Clat. Yes, we are aware of it. We will not be partaking in it at all. We have no desire. Professor, back to you.
Yeah, facts. All right. So finally, many parts of northwestern Europe had achieved a kind of saturation with humankind by the 14th century. The great frontier boom that began about 900 led to a replication of manors and fields across the face of the land, until, at least in the most densely inhabited regions, scant forests remained. Since woodlands were vital for fuel and as a source of building materials, mountain shortages created severe problems for human occupancy. In Tuscany, collision between an expanding peasant population and the agricultural resources of the land seems to have occurred even earlier, so that a full century before the Black Death struck, depopulation had begun. On top of this, the climate worsened in the 14th century, so that crop failures and partial failures became commoner, especially in northerly lands as the length and severity of winter increased. All these circumstances converged at the middle of the 14th century to lay the basis for the shattering experience of the Black Death. The disease broke out in 1346 among the armies of a Mongol prince who laid siege to the trading city of Kaffa in the Crimea. This compelled his withdrawal, but not before the infection had entered Kaffa itself, whence it spread by ship throughout the Mediterranean and ere long to northern and western Europe as well. The initial shock, 1346 to 50, was severe. Die-offs varied widely. Some small communities experienced total extinction. Others, e.g. Milan, which is in Italy, seem to have escaped entirely. The lethal effect of the plague may have been enhanced by the fact that it was propagated not solely by flea bites, but also person to person, as a result of inhaling droplets carrying bacilli that had been put into circulation by coughing or sneezing on the part of an infected individual. Infections of the lungs contracted in this fashion were 100% lethal in Manchuria in 1921. And since this is the only time that modern medical men have been able to observe plague communicated in this manner, it is tempting to assume a similar mortality for pneumonic plague in 14th century Europe. So whether or not pneumonic plague affected Europeans in the 14th century, die-off remained very high. In recent times, mortality rates for sufferers from bubonic infection transmitted by flea bite has varied between 30 and 90%. Before antibiotics reduced the disease to triviality in 1943, it is sobering to realize that in spite of all that modern hospital care could accomplish, the average mortality remained between 60 and 70% of those affected. Despite such virulence, communications patterns of medieval Europe were not so closely knit that everyone was exposed, even though an errant ship and infected rat population could and did bring the plague to remote Greenland and similarly distant outliers of the European heartlands. Overall, the best estimate of plague-provoked mortality, 1346 to 50, in Europe as a whole is that about 1/3 of the total population died. This is based on a projection upon the whole continent of probable mortality rates in the British Isles, where the industry of 2 generations of scholars has narrowed the range of uncertainty to a decrease in population during the plague's initial onset of somewhere between 20 and 45%. Transferring British statistics to the continent as a whole at best defines an approximate magnitude for guess estimation. In northern Italy and French Mediterranean coastlands, population losses were probably higher. In Bohemia and Poland, much less, and for Russia and the Balkans, no estimates have ever been attempted. Whatever the reality may have been, and it clearly varied sharply from community to community and in ways no one could in the least comprehend, we can be sure that the shock to accustomed ways and expectations was severe. Moreover, the plague did not disappear from Europe after its first massive attack. Instead, recurrent plagues followed at irregular intervals and with varying patterns of incidence, sometimes rising to a new severity and then again receding. Places that had escaped the first onset commonly experienced severe die-off in later epidemics. When the disease returned to places where it had raged before, those who had recovered from the previous attack were of course immune, so that death tolls tended to concentrate among those born since the previous plague year. In most parts of Europe, even the loss of as much as a quarter of the population did not at first make very lasting differences. Rather heavy population pressure on available resources before 1346 meant that eager candidates were at hand for most of the vacated places. only positions requiring relatively high skills, farm managers or teachers of Latin, for instance, were likely to be in short supply. But the recurrences of plague in the 1360s and 1370s altered the situation. Manpower shortages came to be widely felt in agriculture and other humble occupations. The socio-economic pyramid was altered in different ways in different parts of Europe, and darker climates of opinion and feeling became as chronic and inescapable as the plague itself. Europe, in short, entered upon a new era of its history, embracing as much diversity as ever, since reactions and readjustments followed differing paths in different regions of the continent, but everywhere nonetheless different from the patterns that had prevailed before 1346. In England, where scholarly study of the plague has achieved by far its greatest elaboration, population declined irregularly but persistently for more than a century, and reached a low point sometime between 1440 and 1480. Nothing comparably definite can be said about other parts of Europe, though there is no doubt whatever that plague losses continue to be a significant element in the continent's demography until the 18th century. If one assumes that population decay lasted about as long on the continent as in England, an assumption liable to innumerable local exceptions, but plausible overall, the period required for medieval European populations to absorb the shock of renewed exposure to plague seems to have been between 100 and 133 years, i.e., about 5 to 6 human generations. This closely parallels the time Amerindian and Pacific Island populations later needed to make an even more drastic adjustment to altered epidemiological conditions, and suggests that, as in the case of Australian rabbits exposed to myxomatosis, 1950 to 53, there are natural rhythms at work that limit and define the demographic consequences of sudden exposure to initially very lethal infections. Parallel to this biological process, however, was a cultural one, whereby men, and perhaps rats too, learned how to minimize risks of infection. The idea of quarantine had been present even in 1346. This stemmed from biblical passages. Prescribing the ostracism of lepers, and by treating plague sufferers as though they were temporary lepers. 40 days quarantine eventually became standard. Those who remained in good health found a public and approved way to express their fear and loathing of the disease. Since everyone remained ignorant of the roles of fleas and rats in the propagation of the disease until the very end of the 19th century, quarantine measures were not always effectual. Nevertheless, since doing something was psychologically preferable to apathetic despair, quarantine regulations became institutionalized, first at Ragusa, 1465, then at Venice, 1485, and the example of these two Adriatic trading ports was widely imitated elsewhere in the Mediterranean thereafter. The requirement that any ship arriving from a port suspected of plague had to anchor in a secluded place and remain for 40 days without communication with the land was not always enforced. And even when enforced, rats and fleas would sometimes come ashore while human beings were prevented from doing so. All the same, in many cases, such precautions must have checked the spread of plague, since if isolation could be achieved, 40 days was quite enough to allow a chain of infection to burn itself out within any ship's company. The quarantine rules, which became general in Christian ports of the Mediterranean in the 16th century, were therefore well founded. Yet plague continued to filter past such barriers and continued to constitute a significant demographic factor in late medieval and early modern times in all parts of Europe. In the Mediterranean, access to the enduring reservoir of rodent infection was especially easy via Black Sea and Asian minor ports. Outbreaks of plague were therefore frequent enough to keep the quarantine administration of all major ports continuously alive until, in the 19th century, new ideas about contagion led to relaxation of old rules. The last important plague outbreak in the Western Mediterranean occurred in around Marseille, which is in France, 1720 to 1721. But until the 17th century, occasional plague outbreaks carrying off anything up to a third or a half of the city's population in a single year were normal. Venetian statistics, for instance, which became fully reliable by the second half of the 16th century, showed that in 1575 to 77, and again in 1630 to 31, a third or more of the city's population died of plague. Outside the Mediterranean, European exposure to plague was less frequent, and public administration in late medieval and early modern times was less expert. The result was to make visitations of plague rarer, and at least sometimes also more catastrophic. Particularly interesting case was the outbreak of plague in northern Spain, 1596 to 1602. One calculation holds that 500,000 died in this epidemic alone. So remember, Spain, right? They were meant to be one of the major enslavers, you know? Remember, they went to the Americas, and they were one of the first to encounter, you know, the original people who were already there. And we know they took them back to Spain, some of them, and they was moving some of them around the continent. But here was telling you that millions of them died. Or 500,000 died. And this was 1596 to 1602. So this is, you know, supposed to be during the times of, you know, American Indian enslavement, before you had what they're calling African chattel enslavement. So they're saying that there were subsequent outbreaks in 1648 to 52 and 1677 to 85, more than double the number of Spaniards who died of plague in the 17th century. Pasteurella pestis must thus be considered as one of the significant factors in Spain's decline as an economic and political power. So, you know, diseases, epidemics hit economies and financial strength. So what financial and, you know, physical strength in numbers did they have, you know, to still all these millions of Africans if they're losing 500,000 people in Spain?
Yes, Professor, to which, of course, I'm just scratching my head because it just makes no sense.
In Northern Europe, the absence of well-defined public quarantine regulations and administrative routes, religious as well as medical, with which to deal with plagues and rumors of plague, gave scope for violent expression of popular hates and fears provoked by the disease. In particular, long-standing grievances of poor against rich often boiled to the surface. Local riots and plundering of private houses sometimes put the social fabric to a severe test. After the Great Plague of London, 1665, Pasteurella pestis withdrew from northwestern Europe, though it remained active in the eastern Mediterranean and in Russia throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. Quarantine and other public health measures probably had less decisive overall effect in limiting the outbreaks of plague, whether before or after 1665. Than other unintended changes in the manner in which European populations coexisted with fleas and rodents. For instance, in much of Western Europe, wood shortages led to stone and brick house construction, and this tended to increase the distance between rodent and human occupants of the dwelling, making it far more difficult for a flea to transfer from a dying rat to a susceptible human. okay, so they were running out of wood, so they had to start making houses out of brick. But you think they were using all of these European trees to make ships, to take people on, to be prisoners somewhere else.
That's a red flag.
So again, there was a wood shortage, which led to a redevelopment in the construction of people's homes. Then you put 2 and 2 together. What ships were they building? Where were they getting the wood from? They weren't getting it from Europe. So ask yourself, where was the wood coming from? Where were the ships being made?
Yeah, I wonder that.
Probably in the same place, where they sailed to.
Exactly.
Where there was lots of trees. Where is the world's #1 timber industry at? Where is that?
That would be AMER'ICAN.
All right. And I think I'm going to leave it here for this book because this chapter is quite a huge one. I just wanted to get into it a little bit. So yeah, what we've been reading from, we've been taking a look at Plagues of Peoples by William H. McNeill. And the chapter was The Mongol Empire's Impact on Disease Balances. So we're going to cut to another break now, and then I've got some more stuff to get through. There probably will be a part 4, but let's do it.
And yes, as we slide to the bar once again for some light refreshments, and that's a first. We're going to a part 4. Wow, Professor, unprecedented. But yeah, keep bringing it. Here's the first. Listen. Oh gosh.
All right. Country for sale, apply within. Now Google tell me what I want. I hear them sell off everything. Name your price if the bargain is right. Ooh yeah, with the right connections, you can have anything that you like. Ooh yeah. Alright there, you can have anything. Everyone I say look, say look. Oh Lord, yeah. Look how them I sell out, sell out. Oh. Hey, Jamaica, sell off. Oh yeah. Airport Donald song start, save off. Look there, down a wharf. You may think it's a joke, I see no reason to laugh. They be making promises, but all they're doing is talk. I say, with the right connections, you can have anything that you like. Ooh, yeah. Alright there, you can have anything. Everyone I say look, say look. Oh Lord, yeah. Look how them I sell out, sell out. Oh. Hey. Turn your backs on your neighbor in moments of need. Lord, you put your personal favor and your economic greed before the needs of the nation that you have pledged to serve and uphold. Oh, cause they don't have to answer. They're the ones who wrote the laws. Misappropriation of public funds for your fancy house and cars. Lavish trips you take, while taxpayers' backs you break. Oh, the price we pay to live. This is economic sacrilege. Country for sale, apply within. Now, Barney, tell me what I want. How you make them sell out everything? Name your price if the bargain is right. Oh yeah, with the right connections. You can have anything that you like. Oh yeah, what did I say? You can have anything if you wanna sell out, sell out. Oh, child, look there, look how they must sell out, sell out. Oh, child, how make you sell out, sell out. I would like to know, why you sold out of beautiful Jamaica now? Country for sale, apply within. Now could they tell me what I want? How to make them sell off everything?
Once again, sounds of Mr. Buju Banton, track entitled Country for Sale, and that was released this year as of April this year. Available all good music retailers and stockists. Make sure you go cop it. And brothers and sisters, I want you to go and listen to that track again. Run the replay or go find it if you're at your desktop right now and listen to the lyrics. He's talking about the country for sale, sellouts, this, that, and the fourth. I think it's quite prevalent at this time that we're doing such an in-house cleanse. So we need to cleanse all these sellouts, you get me? But anyway, here's the double. Listen.
Got to believe in you, yeah. Got to believe in yourself. Got to be true to yourself. Trying to keep your head up. In this world, many want to get their head up.
Miss say origines. Keep your head up in these times. One more time.
Got to believe in you, yeah. Got to believe in yourself. Got to be true to yourself. Trying to keep your head up. In this world, many want to get their head up. But you know, can't let it go. Got to hold on, yeah. To some you're never good enough. If you're too good, some get jealous. Which way to go? You got to know, yeah. If you're true to yourself, then you know what is right for you. Well, alright. Got to choose for yourself the things you wanna do. Well, believe in yourself. Yeah, alright. Got to be true to yourself. Can't be exactly sure of no one else, no. So make your decision. Which way you wanna go, yeah. Follow some people, where you end up, you'll never know. No. Take it from who you take advice. Cause some people, they just seem to be nice. But if you're true to yourself, then you know what's right for you. You got to choose for yourself what things you wanna do. Got to believe in yourself. Alright, got to be true to yourself. Can't be exactly sure of no one else. No. Gotta follow. Yeah, just give me the words made up. Everybody got something to say. Trying to keep your head up. This world made you want to get fed up. Can't let it go. This you got to know. Yeah, just some you're never good enough. You're too good, so get jealous. Which way to go? You got to know. Got to be true to yourself. Then you know what's right for you. Got to choose for yourself the things you wanna do. Believe in yourself. True to yourself.
Once again, sounds of the late great Sugar Minot, track entitled Believe in Yourself. And yes, Origines, believe in yourself and you can accomplish anything that you will. Available at all good music retailers and stockists. Make sure you go cop it. And without further ado, Professor Hot Stepper, back to you.
All right, so let's keep it moving. Some of you might recall what I'm going to be using now, but it does fit in with the topic at hand. Those of you that don't, I'm sure it will be a pleasant revelation to you. So let's get back into the screen share so we can show this.
And once again, brothers and sisters, to let you know that there will be no Empress's Bill tomorrow. The Empresses will be returning the following Sunday and they will be back with a vengeance. And more importantly, they will be back with more fire. Professor, back to you.
All right. So this is one that I've had in my stash for a while. Like I said, some of you might recall this one. I believe I brought this one out on a Lacona Corner in the past. So this is Clean Aztecs and Dirty Spaniards. And this is written by the woman you can see on the right.
Wow, Professor, the title just says it all.
We'll have a bit of fun now in the last segment. So this article was kindly written especially for us. Well, we helped a little with the Aztecs bit by Catherine Ashenberg, prize-winning non-fiction author, lecturer, and journalist. Her latest book, The Dirt on Clean, is a social history of Western cleanliness, which holds a welcome mirror up to our intimate selves.
Professor, can you just say that bit of history of what?
History of Western cleanliness.
Straight like that.
Many things about Aztec civilization amazed the Spaniards, the Spanish conquistadors, including their intensive, highly productive agricultural system, chinampas, or floating gardens. And there you've got one here. This is some of the remaining chinampas, Xochimilco, near Mexico City. So, and the size and sophistication of their great Tenochtitlan, which is on picture 2, which I think we'll see further down. At a time in Europe when street cleaning was almost non-existent, and people emptied their overflowing chamber pots into the streets as a matter of course, the Aztecs employed 1,000 public service cleaners to sweep and water their streets daily. Built public.
Hot Stepper.
Could you possibly rewind and come again?
At a time in Europe when street cleaning was almost non-existent and people emptied their overflowing chamber pots into the streets as a matter of course, the Aztecs employed 1,000 public service cleaners to sweep and water their streets daily.
Straight like that.
Built public toilets in every neighborhood and transported human waste in canoes for use as fertilizer.
Oh, Professor, would that sounds like pre or early modern sewage system?
Right, exactly. So they learned that from who? It's not a European irrigation. It's not a human invention. I mean, it's not a modern European invention.
Mm-hmm.
They came and they found that. They found irrigation in the Americas and took it back.
And who were the people that invented the irrigation? Origines.
And now look, picture 2. They will just mention this. The city of Tenochtitlan, painting by Miguel Covarrubias. And this is in the National Museum of Anthropology, Mexico City. So floating cities. Floating cities.
Wow.
1,000 people cleaning them daily.
I would like, sounds like the kind of place I'd like to live, Professor, wouldn't you?
Yep.
And Origines in the chat and on the playback, wouldn't you like to live there? Because I sure as hell would.
You see how good that looks? That's what they came and saw. They didn't come and see these primitive savages that they always tell you about. They saw sophistication and they saw innovation.
Origine innovation, I might add. But anyway.
Right. So, while London was still drawing its drinking water from the polluted River Thames as late as 1854, the Aztecs supplied their capital city with fresh water from the nearby hill of Chapultepec by means of 2 aqueducts, the first built by Netzahualtotl between 1466 and 1478, the second some 20 years later by the ruler Ahuetzotl. The symbolic importance of water to the Aztecs is clear from their metaphorical word for city, Altepetl, which means literally water mountain in Nahuatl. The aqueducts were described by Hernan Cortes in 1520, and this is what Hernan Cortes says. So we know Hernan Cortes is a very famous conquistador. So when he came and saw all this, he said, along one of the causeways to this great city run 2 aqueducts made of mortar. Each one is 2 paces wide and some 6 feet deep, and along one of them a stream of very good fresh water, as wide as a man's body, flows into the heart of the city, and from this they all drink. The other, which is empty, is used when they wish to clean the first channel. Where the aqueducts cross the bridges, the water passes along some channels which are as wide as an ox, and so they serve the whole city.
Wow. You see, once again, origine engineering. Why would you settle for anything less? But I digress. Professor, back to you.
Right. So now we've got picture 3 here. This is a stylized image of Aztec daily life. Detail of mural by Regina Rule, Passage, Mexico, 1964. And again, this is in the National Museum of Anthropology, Mexico City. So you can see people there.
Oh, and Professor, I just noted some as well. The picture of the brothers and the originally brothers and sisters of that time. I'm seeing a difference in tone, copper-colored tones from the lightest to the darkest. Just say.
So, but probably nothing seemed more bizarre to the Spaniards than the Aztec attitude to personal hygiene. In a word, they valued cleanliness. The conquistador Andres de Tapia reported in a tone of wonder that Montezuma bathed twice a day. He did, but there was nothing extraordinary about that for an Aztec, since everybody, according to the Jesuit historian Francisco Javier Clavijero, bathed often, and many of them every day, in the rivers, lakes, or pools. Who does that sound like?
Speaks for itself.
They lacked true soap, but made up for it with the fruit of the copalzutl, called the soap tree by the Spanish, and the sticky root of the zuhamoli, or soap plant, Saponaria americana. Both gave a lava rich enough to wash body and clothes. The Encyclopedic Florentine Codex, written with Aztec informants shortly after the conquest, includes a small illustration and description of the amoli soap plant, which you can see in picture 4.
Look at that, Professor. We have natural soap plants. I mean, this just speaks for itself. I mean, what can you say? What can you say? Just simply outstanding.
So, this amoli soap plant, it is long and narrow like reeds. It has a shoot. Its flower is white. It is a cleanser. The large Thick roots remove one's hair, make one bald. The small, the slender ones are cleansers, a soap. They wash, they cleanse, they remove the filth.
Wow, Professor, can you say that again, please?
Could you possibly rewind and come again?
So it is long and narrow, like reeds. It has a shoot. Its flower is white. It is a cleanser. The large, the thick roots remove one's hair, make one bald. The small, the slender ones are cleansers, a soap. They wash, they cleanse, they remove the filth. Their documents also make frequent mention of deodorants, breath fresheners, and dentifrices. So Spaniards of the time cleaned their teeth with urine.
What?
As well as bathing in lakes and rivers, the Aztecs cleaned themselves often daily in low sauna-like hothouses.
Well,
An external fire heated one of the walls to red hot, and the bather threw water on the baking wall, creating steam. Steam houses are American.
oh, wow. You know what, Professor? That deserves a boom drop for that. So, bathing houses that we know from so-called Greek times and so-called Roman times and in so-called Russia, as you said, is an originally AMER'ICAN thing. Wow.
Remember, Born Free showed us all of these classical structures in the Americas, which are American. You know, these things are being called Greek and Phoenician, but they're American. Your bathhouses are no different.
Mm-hmm.
It's from home. It's from the home team.
Yes.
So, as in a traditional Russian steam bath, the bathers could speed up perspiration by thrashing themselves with twigs and grass. Almost every building had such a bathhouse, or temazkali, used for medical treatments and ritual purifications as well as ordinary grooming. And look, here, look, you've got picture 5, so they're washing their hair. This is from the Florentine Codex, book 2. As Jacques Soustelle has written, a love of cleanliness seems to have been general throughout the population. The Florentine Codex hints at the importance placed on personal hygiene in documenting the instructions given by an Aztec father to his daughter. So this is what they're saying an Aztec father would typically say to his daughter. In the morning, wash your face, wash your hands, clean your mouth. Listen to me, child. Never make up your face nor paint it. Never put red on your mouth to look beautiful. Makeup and paint are things that light women use. Shameless creatures. So light women, who do you think he's talking about?
Bluefoots.
If you want your husband to love you, dress well, wash yourself, and wash your clothes. Who does that sound like?
Enough said.
And look, picture 6. You've got an Aztec temazkali bathhouse from the Codex Tudela. So again, this is all American. So into this hygienically enlightened place funded the Spaniards. 16th century was one of the dirtiest periods in European history.
Mm-hmm.
And on top of that, the Spaniards had their own unique distrust of cleanliness. Europe in general had gone from a culture where people enjoyed a regular trip to the town or neighborhood bathhouse to a culture that shunned water as dangerous. The catalyst was the Black Death of 1347, a plague that would ultimately kill at least 1 out of every 3 Europeans. When Philippe VI of France asked the medical faculty of the University of Paris to pronounce on this terrifying occurrence in 1348, they wrote that hot baths, which created openings in the skin, allowed disease to enter the body.
What?
Bathhouses all over Europe were closed, and for 400 or 500 years, people avoided water as much as possible.
Professor.
Could you possibly rewind and come again?
So bathhouses all over Europe were closed, and for 400 or 500 years, people avoided water as much as possible.
Oh, wow. I'm just
500 years. But isn't that as? They say slavery was about 400 years. So without a bath.
You know, Professor, I'm going to say this, you know, back in the days when I was going school and that, you know, I come across this type of information, but this just corroborates it even more. 400 to 500 years they were avoiding water, closing bathhouse. Wow, that's just a major red flag. And also, not only that, survey says.
For those who wanted to think of themselves as clean, a fresh linen shirt for a man and a fresh camise for a woman was considered safer and even more effective than water. I bet Cherokee wants it one more time. One more time, like the decks.
Could you possibly rewind and come again?
So bathhouses all over Europe were closed, and for 400 or 500 years, people avoided water as much as possible. For those who wanted to think of themselves as clean, a fresh linen shirt for a man and a fresh camise for a woman was considered safer and even more effective than water.
But Professor, before you carry on, hold on a second. They're saying that a fresh linen shirt for men or women of those Bluefoots was more effective. But hold on a second. In order to have a fresh shirt, you have to wash that in water. So, hey, come again?
Right, that makes no sense.
It doesn't. That's just a flag.
So Louis the 16th? Is that 16th? I think Louis the 16th of France only bathed. Say that again.
It's Louis the 14th because the 1 comes before the V, so that's 5 minus 1, which is 4. So it's Louis the 14th, if I'm reading it correctly. Anybody in the class, please correct me if I'm incorrect.
Yeah. Okay, so Louis now of France only bathed twice in a long athletic life, but he was regarded as unusually clean because he changed his linen shirt twice a day. So they're saying basically, from birth to death, he only bathed twice.
Sacre bleu!
Twice in his whole life. He was
That's a red flag in itself.
These people are the ones that stole you from Mama Africa, though, apparently. I mean, if you give them that kind of power, then I guess they did you.
Of course, if you give them that power, survey says.
The 16th century Spaniards inherited that pan-European feel of water, but they had an additional, peculiarly Spanish aversion to cleanliness.
What?
Like every other part of the Roman Empire, they had their own well-patronized bathhouses. But when the Visigoths conquered Spain in the 5th century, they scorned hot baths as effeminate and weakening, and they demolished the bathhouses, so they destroyed them.
Wow.
Got rid of them. By the time the Moors invaded the country in 711, the Spanish had lost the old bath-loving link. At that point, they saw the Moors' well-washed ways as part of their heretical convictions and their own dirtiness as a Christian virtue.
What?
Some early Christians had regarded cleanliness as a dangerous luxury along with good food, wine, and sexual enjoyments, and tried to abstain from it. Spain continued in this austere tradition longer than most.
Wow. I just don't know what to say. I'm just speechless.
So Arab Spain sparkled with water, whether in mountains, pools, or hundreds of bathhouses. Christians in the north of Spain, not under Arab rule, continued to revel in their squalor, washing neither their bodies nor their clothes, which they only removed when they fall into pieces, according to a contemporary observer.
Professor Hot Stepper.
Could you possibly rewind and come again?
All right, so it's saying that Arab Spain sparkled with water, whether in fountains, pools, or hundreds of bathhouses. Christians in the north of Spain, not under Arab rule, continue to revel in their swallow, washing neither their bodies nor their clothes, which they only remove when they fall into pieces, according to a contemporary observer. The more their Arab conquerors washed, the more suspicious, decadent, and unchristian the practice seemed to the Spaniards. Their dislike endured long after the Arabs had left. So what we got? Picture 10, part of the recently restored Moorish baths dated from 1333 to 1374, now in the Gibraltar Museum. And we've got picture 11, Diego Rivera's critical view of the role of the Spanish church in colonial Mexico, part of his mural of Mexican history, National Palace, Mexico City. So Richard Ford, a 19th century English traveller who knew Spain well, spoke for many when he connected a centuries-old Spanish distaste for washing with the Moorish occupation. He wrote, the mendicant Spanish monks, according to their practice of setting up a directly antagonistic principle to the Arabs, considered physical dirt as the test of moral purity and true faith.
What?
And by dining and sleeping from year's end to year's end in the same unchanged woolen frock, arrived at the height of their ambition, according to their view of the odor of sanctity, the olor de santidad. This was a euphemism for foul smell when it came to represent Christian godliness, and many of the saints are pictured sitting in their own excrement.
Wow.
So there's that.
Wow. Wow.
So they had dirty saints.
Well, you know what? That sounds about right, though, doesn't it, Professor? Especially with all the scandal, what's going on with all these saints and priests and blah 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 blah. But I digress.
So Cardinal Jimenez de Cisneros himself, a Franciscan, wrote Ford, persuaded King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella to close and abolish the Moorish baths after their conquest at Granada. They forbade not only the Christians, but the Moors from using anything but holy water. Fire, not water, became the grand element of inquisitorial purification.
Professor, I would say that that the
Fire
is what they need more than anything. I digress.
I don't know how you replace fire with water when they're polar opposites, but you know. So picture 13 is traditional Moorish baths. Picture 12, Cardinal Cisneros. That's the ruins of the Moorish baths at Ronda. Sure enough, one of the first things the Spaniards did during the Reconquest was to destroy the Moorish baths, just as the Visigoths had destroyed the Roman ones. Even after that, suspicions remained. Moors who converted to Christianity were forbidden to bathe. During the Inquisition, one of the worst things that could be said about Jews as well as Moors was that they were known to bathe. As Richard Ford noted, these attitudes were still current in the 19th century. That was only yesterday.
Yeah.
And that wasn't long ago. We just came up out of that.
That's right. That was just round the corner.
He tells the story of the Spanish Duke of Frazee, who visited an English lady for a fortnight and never once troubled his basins and jugs. On his washstand in his bedroom, he simply rubbed his face occasionally with the white of an egg.
What? I say, Professor, great Scott!
Man thought a raw omelette was the way to get clean. Oh, sorry, man. If you let these people say they stole you from somewhere else and they was like Thanos, I don't know what to say.
And of course, if you're saying that, you've just taken another L.
Because mind you, look, they're openly categorically shown you they had no levels to this game, and you're going to say that these people just whooped you and stole you, and so you clearly don't love yourself, because they clearly didn't love themselves. They thought that water was a unchristian sin. They thought they could replace water with fire and the white of an egg, and you let them say they stole you from somewhere, and they called you Toby, and you let them do that. This fraud assures us was the only ablution used by Spanish ladies in the time of Philip that fourth. Philip the Fourth.
Yeah, Philip the Fourth. Yes.
Yeah, and apparently it was good enough for the Duke. Imagine then the redolence of the conquistadors after weeks of close confinement in a ship on arrival in a hot country. To make the contrast between the Spaniards and Aztecs even more stark, the Aztecs, they're going to say being originally Asian, had many fewer merocrine glands than Westerners, and those are the glands that produce sweat. Asians will tell you that even a very clean Westerner smells strong to an Asian nose, so the fragrance of the unwashed conquistadors must have been impressive, if not downright disgusting to the Aztecs. Small wonder that they responded by fumigating the Spaniards with incense as they approached. Don't your people burn incense?
Yep.
In your yard?
Yep.
The Spaniards took it as an honor, but for the Aztecs it was a practical necessity. And then they just dry snitched there. Look, they're telling you natives come from Asia. They're Asians. Just got it here. So nobody's under any confusion as to who everybody is. Everybody knows.
Oh, and Professor, something just come back to my mind. I remember one time, this going back some years, something to sidetrack, but one of the people that I know that lives on the estate where I live, he now lives in Jamaica, he was telling me accounts that he come across that when so-called Cristobal Colon, or Cristobal Colon should I say, yeah, when he came over, those Spaniards had lice and that crawling all over them, and their faces looked grimy, they stank, which is just standard procedure for them. Boy, you know what? This article here is just painting that even more vividly in my mind. But I digress. Professor, back to you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, there you have it for your part 3. You get to the end on a high. So, clean Aztecs rather, and dirty Spaniards. And that was by Catherine Ashenberg. So, again, we've always been clean, we've always been very hygienic. We kickstarted a lot of hygienic practices which are now commonplace throughout the rest of the world. As usual, these things are credited to other civilizations, other populations of people, but as usual, a lot of times we can trace it back to ourselves. So as I said, there will be a part 4. I've got some final stuff to show you for this topic, and hopefully that will be next week, or it might not be next week. Actually, it might have to be the week after. But either way, we'll get round to it. We will continue with part 4 as planned. But yeah, I hope everybody enjoyed today's episode. Shout out to everybody that made it through.
Big up.
Coming up to the backup channel while I've been serving my van elsewhere. So the channel should be coming back early to mid-September. So on the safe side, I'm going to wait until end of September, and then by then the ban should have been lifted, and it should be business as usual on the main platform. So hope everyone's good, and until next time, I'll catch you soon.
And yes, once again, brothers and sisters, watch out for the notification for part 4 of this episode 19, Knocking at Death's Door, which, as Professor said, may occur next week or the week after. Just watch for the notification. And once again, brothers and sisters, make sure on your desktop or your laptop, or especially your mobile device, make sure that you select all notifications so that you get notified of all times when we go live or uploads that have been uploaded. And once again, Professor, you just outdone yourself. Just simply brilliant. And as we slide to the bar for some light refreshments, it's a triple on the rocks by orders of Professor Hot Stepper. Listen.
How can you, 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 how can you be so ungrateful after all that God has done for you?
What? Say what?
And how can you be so unruly knowing He controls your destiny? In the stars His handiwork I see, and on the wind He speaks with majesty. And oh, what a wonderful feeling, if only you could see. It was ordained for us to live in peace, not to hate each other, living like beasts. Why do we fight every day, not living the Father's way? How can you be so ungrateful after all that God has done for you? And how can you be so unruly knowing He controls your destiny? Out of love and grace He gave us life that we can live, yeah. But we don't appreciate love, so we're living hatred and love. No love, no. It was ordained for us to live in peace, yeah. Not to hate each other, living like peace. Why do we fight every day, not living the Father's way? Yeah. How can you be so ungrateful after all that God has done for you? Yeah. And how can you be so unruly knowing He controls your destiny? How can you be so ungrateful after all that God has done for you? Yeah. Yes, how can you be so unruly knowing He controls your destiny? I say, how can you be so ungrateful? Yeah. How can you, how can you, yeah. How can you, yeah, be so ungrateful after all that God has done for you? Yeah. And how can you be so unfaithful knowing He?
Once again, sounds of Mr. Luciano, track entitled How Can You? Available at all good music retailers and stockists. Make sure you go cop it. That one there has such a powerful message in it. How can we be so ungrateful after all that the Creator has done for us? Real talk. Here's the double.
Heaven declared the glory of God, and the firmament showeth His handiwork. In this world of confusion, beware of your problem.
Professor Hot Stepper.
The heaven declared the glory of Jah, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. In this world of confusion, beware of your problems. You got to be conscious. Seek knowledge, wisdom, let understanding be your guide. Sustain the life that I live.
To purchase this song, please visit the description box below. That's Heaven Declare by Yeshiva McLeod out of the Stingray Records. Thanks for listening.
Acceptable, oh Jah.
My apologies for that.
The heavens declare the glory of Jah, and the firmament show its handiworks. Day unto day, unto speech, night unto night. Show his handiwork. Let the heaven declare the glory of God, and the firmament show its handiworks. Day unto day, unto speech, night unto night. Show his handiworks. Don't be as a hypocrite, for the Father knows what you need out of life. Ask and it shall be given. Knock, knock on the door, it shall be opened. There's no speech, no language where the voice is not heard. Let the blessings flow. Let the heavens declare the glory of Jah.
And yes, once again, my apologies for that. That was the wrong track to play, although it was the correct track, but not the right one. Sounds of Empress Yashima McLeod, track entitled Heavens Declare, available at all good music retailers and stockists. Make sure you go cop it. And the rhythm track that she did that on, that's a classic banger. Make sure you go cop it. Here's the triple, then we out of here. Oh, ho, ho, ho. Oh, ho, ho. Say what?
My sweet Lord, my Lord, my Lord, I really want to see you. I really want to be with you. I really want to see you, Lord, but it takes so long, my Lord. Hallelujah. My sweet Lord. Hallelujah. My Lord. Hallelujah. My Lord. Hallelujah. I really want to know you. Hallelujah. I really want to go with you. Hallelujah. I really want to show you, Lord, that it won't take long, my Lord. My sweet Lord. My Lord. My sweet Lord.
yes, I'm going to take that back to the TOP because I've just been informed via text that Father Gambler is actually listening with Mama Gambler. Shout out to my parents, and my pops is like, yo, rewind that one and come again, boy. May I teach you proper. One more time. Salute, parents.
My sweet Lord, my Lord, my Lord, I really want to see you, I really want to be with you, I really want to see you, Lord, but it takes so long, my Lord. Hallelujah. My sweet Lord. Hallelujah. My Lord. Hallelujah. My Lord. Hallelujah. I really want to know you. Hallelujah. I really want to go with you. I really want to show you, Lord, that it won't take long, my Lord. My sweet Lord. My Lord. My sweet Lord. I really want to see you. I really want to see you. I really want to see you. I really want to see you, Lord, but it takes so long, my Lord. My sweet Lord. My Lord. My Lord, I really want to see you. I really want to be with you. I really want to show you, Lord, that it takes so long, my Lord. My sweet Lord. My sweet Lord. My Lord. My sweet Lord.
Once again, sounds of Mr. Byron Lee and the Dragonaires. Track entitled My Sweet Lord, available at all good music retailers and stockists, and that's lifted from the album Hot Reggae Splashtown and was originally released on Trojan Records in 1971. And I know parents, you're listening right now, or for how much you've been listening, that's brought back some memories to you. You get me? Yes, brothers and sisters, class has now ended. There will be a part 4 either next week or the week after. Make sure you watch out for the notifications and make sure that bell is double clicked to receive all notifications on tablet and cell phone. And on that note, origines forward. And we out. Peace.